Thank you. Hi everyone. As Will said, I'm Emma Nicklin. I'm a PhD student in my second year now at the University of Leeds, but I'm actually based at St James's Hospital within a research group there. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the late effects that childhood brain tumour survivors experience, but I'm going to specifically focus on the late effects of teenage and young adults. So the experiences that they gain as they get older, so say take 5, 10, 15 years after treatment. Okay. So just to start with a little bit of background, I'm not going to go through it too much because there was quite a bit this morning. Brain tumours in children are significantly different to those in adulthood, so they differ in their incidence, treatment types, tumour types, and the overall survival rate is actually better for those in childhood, but because of their bodies and brains are still developing, treatment decisions can be difficult. And some children with malignant tumours will often require both radiation and chemotherapy, and such treatment, especially in very, very young children, can result in significant progressive long-term effects. And with the improvement of tumour treatment and survival rates, childhood brain tumours are now living longer, and many do make it, thankfully, to become teenagers and young adults. And therefore, it's so important to focus on the late effects of treatment and their survivorship experiences. And even though today my main focus is going to be actually on the late effects of survivors, we'll also discuss the experiences of caregivers, because having a brain tumour affects not only the survivor but those around them, and their informal caregivers support the survivors in the long term. So as I said earlier, I'm going to be focusing on specifically the late effects of the teenage and young adults, or TYA group, and this is the age group that I am focusing on in my PhD. And they're a very different survivorship group than those who are still children or older adults. As we all know, adolescence and young adulthood can be a very complex developmental time. We start to gain our self-identity, start new relationships, try to get a bit of independence. And this is why we think this is really important that this group are researched as an individual group, because these unique developmental milestones and life events are very different, as I said, to older or younger people. So to really get an idea of the late effects of this group, we conducted a systematic review. And a systematic review really allows us to collate all the published data and to summarise the findings. And other previous systematic reviews had looked at the late effects of children after treatment, or adults who were older, but none had actually looked at this teenage and young adult group. So what we wanted to answer or look at was, firstly, what are the late effects and issues of this group and their caregivers? Secondly, what are the supportive care needs of this group? And finally, are these supportive care needs actually being met at the moment? And with this review, we set the teenage and young adult age range at 14 to 39. And you might actually think that's quite a wide age range. But in the oncology literature, there is actually no set definition for what a teenager and young adult is. It ranges between countries and organisations. So we purposefully kept it fairly wide for this reason, to capture as much literature as possible. So what we actually found, once we'd searched all the relevant databases, we found 3,770 articles, and once these had been rigorously screened, we were left with 56 articles that published about late effects or supportive care needs. And of the included studies, just to give you a bit of an idea of the results to come, a bit of setting the scene. So over half was published after 2013, so in the last 5 years. And this isn't that surprising, because in the last decade, kind of quality of life research and supported care needs has become more a priority in the research. Over half are published in the US. And the majority of studies reported quantitative data, so survey data. 10% was qualitative, so focus groups, interviews and things like that. And 14% included a bit of both, so mixed methods. And over half the studies reported data from mixed brain tumour samples, so they didn't look at just one brain tumour type, it was all primary brain tumours. And 29% of the papers actually reported brain tumour data with other cancer data, but reported brain tumour data separately, which is why they were included in the review. So, what did we find? If you remember, aim 1 was to look to identify survivor effects and issues. And we actually mapped the survivor issues onto this quality of life model. So the model's been adapted to illustrate the potential issues and late effects that TYA brain tumour survivors may encounter after they've had childhood brain tumour. And in the literature, social issues were the most commonly reported, with 34 articles reporting some form of social issue. So say such as issues with independence. For example, many of us growing up, getting your driving licence is kind of a key part, getting some independence from parents. But childhood brain tumours were less likely to drive than other cancer groups and other control groups. And then, say if we look at romantic relationships, if you have a brain tumour as an adult, you might already have cemented your relationships with friends, and you may even be married. But once you've had a brain tumour as a child, you might find it harder to meet someone and form a romantic relationship. And the literature revealed that young adults who've had a brain tumour are less likely to have romantic relationships when compared to other cancer survivors, and they're also less likely to get married. Then if we look at cognitive late effects, these were reported in 28 articles. The main cognitive issue reported was impaired memory, and the published findings established that impaired memory is a daily issue. Memory is essential in how survivors assess their ability to self-care and meet developmental milestones such as living independently, making friendships and gaining educational achievements. And memory loss and other cognitive effects were actually described as an invisible effect. So unlike, say, physical effects, you can see them. Cognitive effects, they felt sometimes weren't as obvious and could go undetected. And therefore, sometimes this support may not always be offered because of this. Physical late effects were reported again in 28 articles. And so if we take issues with appearance, we know that when you become young adults, you tend to be a bit more conscious of how you look. And teenagers and young adults became more conscious of their physical effects of treatment, such as scarring, weight gain, small stature, and hair loss. So, and many parents actually reported that this could affect how their teenagers or their children could actually make friends with new people because they felt different to their peers. And psychological and spiritual issues were also reported, but not as frequently. So regarding psychological issues, teenage and young adult brain tumour survivors reported significantly poorer mental health when compared to other cancer survivors. Main issues included internalising problems and withdrawal. And then looking at spiritual issues, brain tumour survivors had significantly poorer optimism and self-esteem when compared to other cancer groups. But it's quite interesting that how different the views could be. So some survivors actually felt quite negative about their brain tumour, thinking that others viewed them very differently, but then other survivors actually thought that there'd been positive aspects. It had changed their outlook on life, it made them more mature, and they were trying to actually move beyond the illness. So what else did we find? So as you may, as you may have noticed, a lot of these late effects are rarely experienced in one capacity. They linked, and one thing can lead to another. So for example, poor processing speeds could often affect how survivors could interact with other people, which made them feel isolated with fewer friends. Or survivors who are experiencing fatigue, finding it hard to gain employment because of the fatigue. And overall physical health problems could lead to the survivors not being able to take part in, say, sports in school or with their friends, and they felt it affected their overall social functioning. And in many studies, the late effects described were frequently more prevalent or intense than in other cancer groups, making it likely that brain tumour survivors will have a poor overall well-being. And this supports that brain tumour supportive care should be disease-specific and tailored to individual needs. And the second part of Aim 1, I'm not going to focus on it too much, as I said, but a quick overview, what was found from the caregiver literature. Firstly, there's a lot less data regarding caregiver issues, so only 9 articles reported any caregiver late effects. And we split these down into 5 themes. So starting with survivor well-being, while some caregivers had a kind of positive experience of caregiving, some were really worried about their child's or loved one's ability to succeed socially or academically, which kind of echoes some of the late effects that the survivors had. Uncertainty was a common theme, especially about their survivors' future health. So the threat of relapse was a common worry, and in some cases this actually stopped caregivers from planning into the future. But actually then in other cases caregivers looked more into the future because they were worried about who was going to look after the survivors as they grew older. Caregivers experienced increased responsibilities, doing tasks that for many teenagers it isn't a part of doing, and so caregivers assisted survivors in organising their social interactions, trying to create new friendships, and managing medications. And caregivers also had less time to dedicate to maintaining their own self-well-being, feeling fatigued with reported social functioning, lack of reduced social functioning, and hindered careers. And finally, the pressure of keeping healthy family relationships whilst caring for a teenage survivor could prove to be challenging for caregivers. For some, their marriage had actually suffered, whilst others worried about their relationships with their survivors' siblings. So Aim 2 and 3, if you remember, that was the supportive care needs and whether these needs are being met. And I'm addressing Aims 2 and 3 together because there was very little literature or data on supportive care needs. So actually only 3 articles reported aim to report anything about survivor needs. But where reported, survivors said they valued social activities and support groups, and just the ability, they just wanted to hang out more with people their age. Many survivors said that they needed more educational support, so more one-to-one more one-to-one help, and some extra time to complete assignments. And finally, some of the survivors felt that the long-term follow-up care that they received wasn't meeting all their needs. Problems described was feeling that they couldn't speak to the clinical team about their problems, feeling that the clinical team addressed their parents or their caregivers and didn't actually listen to them, and also feeling that the information they're given wasn't age appropriate for their current issues. Whilst caregivers felt, again, there was not enough support available for them or the survivor during teenage and young adulthood. Caregivers felt that when their child was actually undergoing the treatment that they had a lot of support, but this support had declined as they moved further away from the treatment. And again, caregivers expressed that the following services would be most helpful. So parent support groups or caregiver support groups, specifically for caring for teenage and young adults, and also educational groups look for with age-specific information. And finally, there was no data regarding how and if current support services were used. So we still don't know how TYA survivors and their caregivers are using and benefiting from long-term aftercare and support from local and national charities. Because what we do know is that there are some great local and national charities that offer support to survivors and their caregivers, alongside the long-term follow-up teams. These are just a few examples. And actually, the Brain Tumour Charity does have a teenage and young adult service which has specific materials for this group. So they have a Facebook group just for teenagers. They do teenage-specific meetups, so with other teenagers. And they have an individual online telephone support. So what can we take from this systematic review? So there is gaps in the literature and areas for future research. So we found that there was many late effects that teenage and young adult brain tumour survivors could experience, but there was very little data focused on the needs of this group. Or unmet needs of this group. And despite that numerous studies had reported the late effects and issues, it's known that the presence of issues isn't always associated with the uptake of supportive services. So therefore, 3 areas of research are identified. Studies need to describe the needs and, more importantly, unmet needs of TYA childhood brain tumour survivors and their caregivers. Studies are also need to fully investigate TYA survivor and caregiver expectations and the values of supportive care needs. The value of supportive care services, and find out how and if these are currently being used. So more research is needed to understand what TYA survivors and their caregivers want and how they can benefit from this support. And these future research plans fit under many of the research priorities published by the NCRI and James Lind Alliance. The NCRI held a large survey asking patients and carers and healthcare professionals what they felt there needed to be more knowledge on. And from this data, they've identified 26 priorities for research that they thought would help people with and beyond cancer. And actually, supportive care needs and supportive service use was mentioned in 12 of these 26 priorities, which just shows how important getting the right supportive care is for patients and caregivers. So these are just a few of the 12 that focus on supportive care needs. So, all this being said, I'll move on to what I'm currently doing now. So from the results of this systematic review, I've designed a research project that has become the focus of my PhD, with the aim is to gain an in-depth understanding of the supportive care needs of TYA childhood brain tumour survivors and their caregivers. The specific objectives are to describe the met and unmet needs of this group, to explore if unmet needs differ between different survivors, so males and females, younger teenagers in comparison to older young adults, to determine whether these unmet needs are associated with quality of life. So this is kind of the so what question. So if we find out if someone has higher unmet needs, does this mean that it impacts on their quality of life? And finally, to explore the role and perceived use of support services for both TYA survivors and their caregivers. So I've actually just started data collection, and I've been collecting data from survivors and caregivers who are in the long-term follow-up team, using the long-term follow-up service in Leeds. And I've been asking them to do an online questionnaire to try identify their needs and unmet needs, and also a subgroup of this who have done the online questionnaires, asking them if they'll take part in an interview. Because questionnaire data is good for identifying, say, frequency of needs, but it doesn't always explain the why and why people feel and act as they do. So subsequent to these results, firstly, we can feed back to the support services and the long-term follow-up teams that currently provide support. And then hopefully in the future, this evidence, and with other studies like this, we can help modify and develop support services to address both TYA survivor and caregiver unmet and desired supportive care needs. So I just want to say a quick thank you to my supervision team, and there's actually a paper that's in the process of being published about this systematic review, so that's coming out hopefully in the next few months, and a quick thank you to the funders. And I actually have a research advisory group which is made up of patients and caregivers, and they've been great at kind of directing the research and telling me what's important. So if there's anyone who feels that they'd like to take part in that, I'd be really happy to speak to them. And then thank you for listening. If anyone's got any questions.